Welcome back to another MATLAB Minute. If you're new to the channel, this is a place to get quick explanations, tips, and how-tos for everything related to MATLAB. Most of the channel's content is inspired by common questions from real undergraduate engineering students, so I hope it's helpful. In this MATLAB Minute, I want to give you an explanation for the common error that comes up, which is that of the element-wise multiplication. So if I've got two vectors, say x and y, notice that they're both of the same dimensions, 1 by 600, and I go to multiply them, I'm going to get an error. And it says error using multiply because of incorrect dimensions for matrix multiplication. Typically, you'll want to do this when you want to create a mathematical function in MATLAB that represents a product of two or more functions. This is often the case, for example, if you want to make a variable in MATLAB that's something like e to the minus t sine of 10t, for example. If you want to create this function in MATLAB, that requires you to essentially multiply two vectors together. And the problem here is if we call this x and we call this y, well, traditionally in the linear algebra sense, you cannot multiply two vectors together in this way. For example, x, this may be a long variable, 1 by, in my case it was 601, and y was a vector of the same dimensions. Okay, so in linear algebra, when you want to multiply two matrices or vectors together, okay, the number of columns in the first matrix has to match the number of rows in the second matrix or vector in order for you to produce the traditional product. Okay, in this case, that's not what we're trying to do. By saying z equals e to the minus t sine of 10t, for example, what we're trying to do is to create a third vector of the same dimensions. We're actually trying to create a vector that also has the same dimensions as x and y. And what you're really trying to do is you're really trying to take the first element in e to the minus t, multiply it by the first element in sine of 10t, and place that into a corresponding element into the third vector called z. And you want to basically do that for all of the elements down the vector. Okay, this is why it's called element by element multiplication. And there's a way to do this very easily in MATLAB, and that's the element by element operator, which is essentially it's the dot. Okay, so when students learn this for the first time, they tend to get overexcited or overzealous, and they put dots everywhere in their code, but it's really unnecessary. Okay, it's only when you're trying to multiply two vectors together that have the same dimensions when you need to do this operation. So let's see what that looks like back in MATLAB. Okay, so I've defined a time vector that goes from 0 to 6 in increments of 0.01. My x vector is e to the minus t. My y vector is sine of 10t. Now if I plot each of those functions individually, you will see that, okay, this is e to the minus t, and then if I plot y, I get sine of 10t. And you should know that when you multiply a decaying exponential by a sine wave, you generally get a decaying oscillation. Okay, this is pretty typical of like second order system behavior. So what I'm trying to do is create a vector that's the product of e to the minus t and sine of 10t. Now of course if I just try and multiply x and y together, that's when I get the error because I'm trying to multiply two vectors of the same dimensions, and that's just not going to work. Okay, so what we want to do instead is to multiply x by y in an element by element fashion, and that's where you put the dot before the operator that you want to apply. When I do this, x dot times y, I get a third variable called z, which has the same dimensions of x and y. And then of course if I go ahead and plot t against z, where z is e to the minus t sine of 10t, then I get the plot that I was expecting, which is basically a decaying exponential, which is x, times the sine of 10t, which is y. Okay. One thing you want to do is keep in mind when you need to use element by element multiplications. Okay, so students often get a little bit overexcited when they first realize that you have to put a dot in front of it, and they'll do things like they'll put like a dot in front of the multiplier here in the sine of 10t. Now this will not give you an error, which is probably why students kind of do it, but it's unnecessary because remember 10 is not a vector. 10 is simply a scalar value that will multiply every element in the vector t even without this dot. Okay, so I can do this and I don't get an error, but I can also do this and I will also not get an error. And that hasn't changed anything. It's just that this dot here is completely unnecessary because we are not trying to multiply two vectors of the same dimension. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you go forward. Okay, so this is a quick explanation on the element by element multiplication function. You basically have to just put the dot in front of the operator that's multiplying or dividing two vectors of the same dimension together. Okay, so I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.